This is channel 01 to 1975. This is Karl-James Langford on the 1st of May 2015. And the interesting subject today that we're going to be looking at is a subject I've been teaching all week on the archaeology of disease. Now, some of you may not think that the archaeology of disease is going to be of much interest and it's going to be all about bones. Well, we got a few stuff about bones today, but my students that I've been teaching this week have really thought the subject has been fascinating. But looking at today quickly as part of my video log, it's been a really interesting day in the sense that I did a bit of final teaching of this class in the evening, and my daughter stayed over and going out and about with some of my students to archaeological sites very locally, so that was really good. So, it was a bit of a good day. Now, let's look at the archaeology of disease. I focused that over the next few weeks we're going to be looking at key diseases like the plague and like leprosy and like cholera and yellow fever. But today we're going to be specifically looking at leprosy. Now, one thing that we will all know, those interested in archaeology, is when they go to churches, they always see in the guidebooks the leper's squint. Now, the leper's squint is always seen as the squint that lepers would use to look inside the chancel of a church directed at the altar and the service. But immediately most medieval churches were relatively small, and most of the congregation couldn't get into the church anyway, into the nave. Everybody had to attend service on a Sunday. If you didn't, well, consequences would have been quite grave, literally. Now, the idea of the leper's squint in my head is that because most people wouldn't be able to get inside the church, the leper's squint could be seen as something that most people was used to look inside the church. The idea of the leper when the squints were placed into the churches in 1200s, that most people saw that lepers weren't contagious and they were part of the community, which we'll see in the lecture today. So we see a range of squints from various churches, even this wooden one at Greenstead in Essex. Relatively, people who had leprosy and anyone who was outside the church, whether without a disease or with a disease or what have you, would be given Holy Communion. Generally, I said about the lecture today would be about leprosy, but there's other things about disease as well. But one closing thing about the leper's squint, whenever you see it in a guidebook, you can immediately understand it was for most people and not just for lepers. When we think about disease, we always think about bones, and that most diseases like the plague wouldn't be seen in the bone records. Generally, when you look at mummies, for example, you can gain a rich tapestry of the various diseases that people died of in the past. Diseases like smallpox shown in this image here generally won't be seen in evidence in the bone records, but if some tissue does survive, there would be a DNA record of this yellow fever. Many of the diseases that lepers suffered from were the diseases that would kill them rather than the leprosy itself. Bits of archaeology, as we'll quickly see today at the sites of Chichester and Winchester, tell us a wonderful story about leprosy, which haven't been preserved elsewhere. Those taboos about leprosy come all the way from the Bible and the Middle East, where the Bible told us that leprosy was a disease of the unclean. But in most circumstances, people with leprosy were part of everyday society, particularly up to the 1300s in medieval England, where we get most of the records from in the archaeology and the history. Very little evidence of a disease like leprosy or any disease survives in places like Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland, because generally populations were very less in those areas compared to places like England. The diseases that killed people who had leprosy wasn't leprosy itself. We'll see bone cancer as shown in this illustration. Diseases affecting the mouth, for example, like tooth decay, where you would have an abscess, where you'd have an abscess and it would erupt. Anyway, let's look at some important areas where leprosy has been identified in the ground. Let's first start at a site that is in England. The site itself is in the Middle East, in Jerusalem. It comes from an article back to December 2009 about a shroud that was discovered in a sealed tomb on the outskirts of Jerusalem, in an area, in a cemetery known as the Field of Blood, as mentioned by Matthew in the New Testament. Next to the area where Judah is said to have committed suicide, the tomb of the shrouded man is located, a tomb of prominent people, including Annas, the high priest, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest who was said to have betrayed Jesus to the Romans. This individual, shrouded and buried in a tomb amongst aristocracy, must immediately be seen as somebody being very important. One thing is that the person didn't have a second burial, which is fairly rare because most people had second burials. But it's likely that because this guy suffered from tuberculosis and leprosy, as the DNA of both diseases were found in his bones and in other tissue associated with the body because it was in fairly good preservation, it was unlikely that this person was reburied, but was buried in a type of textile used for shroud wrappings from the time. His clean state of hair indicated that he was an affluent member of society, and the carbon-14 dating evidence tells us of a date between 1 and 50 CE, based on the assumption that this is representative of a typical burial shroud widely used at the time of Jesus. The researchers conclude that the Turin shroud did not originate from the Jesus era of Jerusalem. It's a wonderful piece of archaeological evidence. Furthermore, the new research has shown that molecular pathology clearly adds a new dimension to the archaeological exploration of the disease. The individual had been sealed into the tomb, so we've got uncontaminated DNA evidence. And this is a vital piece of evidence telling us that even though the Bible tells us of people being outcasts who had leprosy, this individual was amongst the society and was buried with the honours of somebody who was treated as part of the society of the age. Back to leper hospitals in England. Medieval England between 1066 and 1485, there were over 300 of them. And these represented a quarter of all medieval hospitals. Archaeological excavation evidence from St. Mary Magdalene, Winchester and Chichester has helped us understand that leprosy, now commonly known as Hansen's disease, even though it was a devastating disease, we now know that the physical deformity caused by leprosy were as a result of other accidents and other diseases. It wasn't leprosy that killed you itself. Today we now start to understand the root causes of the disease, but there was a lot of misunderstanding in the medieval period where people understood that leprosy could be encompassed and inclusive of a whole range of skin disorders. Leper, unfortunately, today is still a word that is used pejoratively in common use in music, literature and film, conjures up images of the unclean outcast. People of contagion and spiritual pollution are doomed to live out their lives separated from family, friend and community. Their hospitals, we are led in the past, not in the archaeology, that this was a disease that put people on the outskirts of medieval urban society. But over the recent years, the archaeological evidence have helped us challenge this view. The belief that medieval lepers were segregated from society ultimately stems from biblical sources, where Levite laws said that a leper had to be brought to a priest, whether they had leprosy or any skin disorders, or were to be outcast from society, to live, quote, outside the camp. Repercussions of this had an influence across and resonation across the whole of Europe, but people in England didn't really accept this edict. The edict itself said prohibited lepers from living in towns or cities, naturally required the majority of leper hospitals to be founded on the outskirts of urban areas. This entrenched view now is believed to be completely false when we look at the archaeological evidence. For example, in England, both physically and spiritually must be approached cautiously. Modern notions of medieval fears of a contagious disease that warranted formal segregation and a spiritual stigma was in fact made worse by Victorian scholars. As fears of contagion, however, were not common until the 1300s, many earlier leper hospitals should be seen in terms of charitable institutions for the incurable rather than isolation wards for the contagious. Leprosaria were recipients of public and civic charity, we now know, challenging the Bible, as well as concrete expressions of ecclesiastical and urban responsibility. In practice, leper hospitals were situated on the outskirts of towns for reasons that had more to do with the availability of land than segregation. Moreover, extramural roadside locations were well suited for the collection of alms and charity, and provided an essential source of income for many foundations. Can be seen at Winchester and Chichester and many examples, leading to the development of leper hospitals, as well as to challenge long-standing myths about the treatment of lepers. In fact, you wouldn't put a hospital in the middle of a town for whatever purpose because there wasn't space. It was placed on the outside because that was the only space available for those who were ill. The example of the leper hospital at Winchester was placed only 1 mile from the city centre and overlooked Winchester, so these people weren't banished from society, they were part of it and dominated society. 1148, the Witten Domesday Book referred to lepers on the hill in Winchester. Excavations have been undertaken at the site that revealed a much earlier site as well, and the cemetery contained a range of individuals buried in neatly spaced rows of carefully carved graves. Most of the burials display signs of leprosy, tuberculosis, hydrocephalus, other disability and malnutrition. A graveyard for everyone, men, women, children, in neonatal burial, when in normal society those without leprosy were in fact segregated, so those that had leprosy were almost as if They were buried in a socialistic time which was within society when the rest of society suffered. Carbon-14 dating sample from another part of the cemetery tells us of much earlier dates. So when 1066 came, and when there were more people with tuberculosis in England, there were examples of tuberculosis at the site and burials, people treated in respects where graves were revered of people who had leprosy, it seems. The findings challenge everything that we were once taught in school and in the Bible. Investment in substantial buildings, both timber and masonry, infirmaries, chapels, indicating physical and spiritual comfort for the inmates, far better than the vulgaris or the common people lived. In death, however, the lepers seem to have been afforded the highest level of respect and dignity. The cemetery graves, which contained a considerable quantity of leper burials, comprised a series of neatly cut anthropomorphic graves with carved head niches. Very few of the graves were intercut. We see intercutting of graves on normal cemeteries of non-lepers, but these seemingly were respected, which is significant as it suggests that they were marked and respected like others in society. The age range of the cemetery is unusual, however. Higher numbers of individuals dying in adolescence or young adulthood than would be expected in a normal cemetery of the period. This is most likely a reflection of the severity of illness afflicting those within the hospital. As noted, one of the later burials in the cemetery contained an individual with no sign of disease, holding a scallop shell, probably representing the burial of a pilgrim, as the shell is a symbol of the pilgrim to the shrine of St. James of Santiago de Compostela, Spain. This was an individual of some prestige, means and religious sensibility, worldly. Importantly, this was also a man who chose to be buried amongst the lepers because it was deemed to be a site that these people could be seen by some as special who had suffered. Over the excavated area, indications that institution was dedicated to the welfare of individuals afflicted with acute illness and disease to a very high degree. Place where the community were afforded a degree of quality of life, status that runs contrary to all that we were ever told about the social circumstances of the leper. Now, thinking about this, other sites have been excavated telling us about the lepers, for example at St. James and St. Mary Magdalene, not at Winchester but at Chichester, where 400 skeletons were excavated, bones analysing a disease that seemingly slowly started to die out by the 1400s. And why was that? Basically in 1348-1352, the plague, along with anthrax and a load of other diseases, made people with leprosy very vulnerable to dying first because of the great tragedy of the plague. So by the time the 1400 comes to us, leprosy is almost extinct in England, although it does carry on. One piece of evidence to follow, bit of history about leprosy quickly. Leprosy is a very old disease so far. The earliest archaeological evidence for human infection with Mycobacterium leprae in the world comes from a skeleton buried around 2000 BC in Rajasthan, India. The earliest written descriptions of the disfiguring disease are found in the Sanskrit of the Atharva Veda, composed before 1000 years BC. The westward spread of leprosy is attributed to Alexander the Great. When he invaded India and parts of Pakistan in 326, his men brought leprosy back to Europe because it can hide in the tissue for 5 to 20 years without any signs, so his men wouldn't have been aware that they were carrying the disease into Europe. Attitudes to the disease in Europe, as we've already said, biblical references said that leprosy was used for all sorts of diseases as an umbrella form: scabies, eczema, dermatitis, Raynaud's disease, elephantitis, various fungal infections. Anyone with a birthmark may be seen as having leprosy. Conflicting advice in the Bible coloured theology. Some saying, for example, in Leviticus, that those with leprosy were unclean without camp shall his habitation be. But others saw it differently when they interpreted the Bible. In great contrast, Lazarus and Mary Magdalene, by contrast, Jesus was accused of associating with lepers and of cleansing them. St. Luke's Gospel records the parable of Lazarus, in which Lazarus is described as a beggar covered in sores, sitting at the rich man's gate. While St. John says that Jesus raised a man called Lazarus from the dead. Though these are two separate individuals, popular conflation of the two led to the assumption that both suffered from leprosy. Hence the common medieval term for lepers was lézard. Similarly, when you look at a conflation of Mary of Bethany with Mary Magdalene, along with the association of leprosy with sexual excesses and prostitution, led to misunderstandings that it was a sexual derived disease when it wasn't. That was something completely different. Caught then between the ideas of lepers as sinful outcasts and lepers as proper objects of charity, the church started to declare by about the 1200 that lepers should have their own churches, houses and priests. Well, it was encouraged by 1215 by the church that lepers should be given their own hospitals and alms for the hospitals. This last decree was a nice piece of sophistry, which boosted benefactions by arguing that lepers were undergoing the punishments of purgatory here on earth, and therefore had an early passport to paradise, where they would be able to intervene all the sooner on behalf of those who had invested in leper hospitals. Hold your hand who helped me, in other words. When we finally look at the evidence, we now starting to understand a variety of evidence of leper hospitals in the country. People coming back from the Crusades, for example, having leprosy, at an example in Chichester. And when you look at the discovery of the remains of religious people, such as a nun with a religious wimple intact on excavation, tells us that it hit all levels of society. So if you're a nun with leprosy, you weren't cast out, you were part of society and buried in that state. Leprosy encompassed everybody, as we have seen. And finally, the decline of leprosy can be tracked through historical reference to the admission of the last leper in 1418, and through the growing variety of diseases and injuries represented in the later graves, as the hospital became more of a general almshouse for the needy. And that was so after the dissolution in 1536. So in other words, all the other diseases are at all and leprosy, when there were maybe Tens of thousands of people with leprosy in England and elsewhere in the Isles. By 1418, the disease was almost gone, thanks somewhere to the works of the hospitals, but also the devastating toll from other diseases on leprosy. This is Karl-James Langford. Hopefully you've enjoyed this look at the diseases that can be seen present in archaeology, and more next week. Thank you.